Welcome to Leaders Upgraded, the place where people who want to upgrade and fast track their career, their life, and their leadership journey tend to gather. I am your host, Tanvi Gautam, and I shall be speaking to the top 10% of the world's leading authors, CEOs, and thinkers to bring you some of the best and brilliant ideas to fast track your way to success. Would you like an upgrade? Let's do this. I'm delighted to welcome Navi Raju on our show today. He's an innovation and leadership strategist, also the author of Frugal Innovation, How to Do Better with Less. So welcome, Navi.
Thanks for having me.
I have been reading your book, and I have to say, this is going to start becoming mandatory reading in all the work that I'm doing with my clients. It's such an exposition of the way companies have to start thinking about leadership and markets and creativity and innovation in the organizations. When I first came across your work, it was in the context of Jugaad innovation. Of course, was focused more on emerging markets in the Indian economy and to do more with less in that context. And now we have Frugal Innovation, which seems to be a more global book with the case studies and stories that you share in there. So for those people who are uninitiated into this conversation, what is frugal innovation? Why should they be paying attention to this idea?
Frugal innovation, in a nutshell, is, as the expression indicates, it's about innovating frugally. That is essentially, instead of spending billions of dollars on R&D, is to find a frugal mechanism with new products and services. The first aspect of frugal innovation is how do you, change your thinking that you need a lot of big budgets, big R&D centers to innovate, and realize that actually you can innovate in a very, economical way. The second aspect of it is how do you also come up with products and services that are more affordable and yet of good quality? And this is becoming a global requirement because not only in emerging markets, but even in the Western economies, since the economic recession, consumers are actually looking for products that deliver better value for the limited money they have. So frugal innovation is about, innovating cheaply, but also coming up with products that are affordable and of good quality.
And I think that, there's a term in the book that you use called the GAFA companies, right? The Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon. And these are certainly companies that are the way business is done. We are looking at companies like Uber, and the sharing economy, right, is really on its way to getting established as a norm of life rather than an aberration. So it's interesting to me that you talked about products that are affordable because there is a segment of the population which is a brand agnostic in some senses because they're looking more for value than anything else. So what I'm hearing you say is do more with less, but also create products that are cheaper and not as expensive. I think that the times that we live in, that's something we really need because there's a resource crunch everywhere.
Yeah, I think, first of all, you're right. I mean, oftentimes, Silicon Valley in the US, of course, and, we always think about the first world and the third world. And, what we don't realize is that there is a bottom of the pyramid, first of all, in every developed country. For example, in Europe, there are 50 million Europeans who are considered as poor or relatively poor. And in the US, for example, you have 70 million Americans who are underbanked. They don't have access to the kind of average banking services that we take for granted. So I think, there is this myth that developed countries are rich countries where everybody, is rich, which is not true. Maybe the rich are getting richer for sure, but the middle class is feeling the squeeze. And research after research shows, for example, in the US, that for the first time since World War II, middle class consumers are afraid that, the children will be financially worse off than their generation. So I think the people are becoming more cost conscious. I think that's something that is reality in the Western world. But beyond that, I think that there's another more important phenomenon. So that the first phenomenon is that if you don't have money, you become value conscious, right? You want value for money. That's well known, for eons. But people are also becoming values conscious. According to Nielsen, 55% consumers want to buy from brands that are socially and environmentally responsible. And they also found that 2/3 of young people want to work for companies that are socially and environmentally responsible. That means that these are consumers that are not just consumers, they are becoming responsible citizens. They want to consume and work for companies that do more with less in terms of, creating more economic and social value in an environmentally responsible way.
Right, so that's an interesting shift right there. So what is your advice on how hierarchical companies, command and control companies, organizations move very slowly given their size, adapt to this idea of frugal innovation and the surrounding and relationships they will have to establish in order to get on with frugal innovation?
Sure. So let's pick G as a good example. So I'm gonna just cite two big initiatives they embarked upon, which really illustrate how they're trying to do more with less. The first one is that G is applying the principles of lean startup, which is coming from Silicon Valley, which is essentially to compress the time to market. So essentially be able to put new products in the marketplace very quickly. And they launched this initiative called Fast Works, essentially a program that aims to close deals 50% faster and launch new products minimum 30% faster. So the idea is essentially to of organization that is very nimble, agile, and they have over 300 projects they've implemented using this approach, which is phenomenal because if you imagine GE working in very complex industries like aerospace, medical devices, etc., they are still able now today to launch new products in a few months instead of many years. So that shows that even elephant can dance, and that's a great example of frugality in terms of saving on time, because time is the most valuable and scarce resource. So they are able to do more at less time. Another interesting project, and this is a very brand new initiative that was being announced. They are actually in the healthcare space. G is actually creating a product line which they call sustainable healthcare solutions. And interestingly, they call them also value products and super value products. So this is essentially a product line of medical devices that will be designed from scratch for a global market segment, which is looking for products, like CT scanners and whatnot, that don't have all the bells and whistles that you may find, and that's important because, I don't know if you realize, but GE is like an engineering driven company. That's Thomas Edison, right? So these are the guys who, love reinventing the wheel and coming up with very complex solutions. But here is GE trying to come up with, relatively simpler to use and more affordable solutions for the masses.
Yeah. It's very interesting because I think in some ways that's changing the paradigm where we used to think if it's more complicated and has more features and more is better, but now we're saying no, we really need to become lean. And how quickly can we move? Because by the time you might be designing your amazing dream product, somebody else might have launched, and so what are you going to do then? So it's kind of also a little bit of a speed to market phenomena. But I wanted you to share the story of Acor as well. And the reason is that, the story of GE sounds like system in transformation and work. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more as we go on in the podcast. But the story of Acor was interesting to me because the story is of a person who's trying to transform an organization. And I really think that a lot of executives who are listening to this podcast need to hear how the ownership that is taken by leaders and executives in organizations becomes so central to this transformation conversation. So if you could share a little bit about that story.
Sure. So Accor is one of the world's leading hotel chain, and they are facing, as you know, competition from, kind of two ends in a way. On one hand, you have people like Expedia.com who are kind of, the whole hotel reservation space, and that's on the distribution side. But then Accor is also facing competition from the sharing economy players like Airbnb. And so you can see how quickly these, nimble digital rivals are stealing market share from Accor. So they realize that if they really want to compete and win in today's, digital knowledge economy, they actually have to team up and partner with nimble players. And nimble players would be startups, could be small, medium businesses. And the idea is essentially to gain new perspectives, new ideas, new solutions from the outside world. And to make that happen, they have a unique title in the world, in my opinion. His title is a Senior Vice President for Entrepreneurship Advocacy. So what he's right, and so what he's trying to do is essentially to connect with small, medium businesses and startups. They have very innovative solutions benefit the company in terms of, connected hotels, digitally connected hotels, or in the area of, safety, and so on and so forth. So he has essentially this unbelievable kind of initiative, which is called a speed dating. So essentially, a couple of times a year, he organizes these speed dating kind of programs. Some promising startups and SMEs pitch their solutions, and then they will have senior executives from the company, Accor Group, or some of the managers of the franchise hotels, who at the end of the speed dating day could say, hey, this particular startup, I'm really interested in working with them. So that very day, they sign a deal with the company, the startup, and then they start piloting a new initiative, right? So that's essentially to say, if we cannot beat the digital players, let's join forces with them.
I was working with a client of mine, and they are 100 years, more than 100 years old company, and we were having this conversation. The group was like, we need to be more like a startup, and but we don't have startup capabilities. And so, one of the solutions that emerged from the discussion that day was, they wanted to implement something called adopt a startup. Unlike what you're saying about Accor, where there's a speed dating model, the suggestion was to send executives into the startups for sabbatical, so that they kind of start imbibing some of the value system and the worldview and the mental models of being in a startup, and to bring them back to the organization.
Yes, I think the idea is essentially to expose, and I think you bring up a good point, right? Is that a lot of companies I know, even today, I met with a large European company which came to Silicon Valley because they are interested in quote unquote partnering with startups. But what happens is that generally it's called open innovation, right? It's a concept that is 15 years old, which is, how can large companies open up and innovate with, nimble startups? The problem is that, as I say in my book, is that when you open up, first of all, two key problems. One is that, the moment you start working with startups, you expose to them the bureaucracy of your company, right? So if it takes 1 month to cut a deal with a startup, they get bored. They will go to another company, right? So the first thing happens is that large companies are not designed in terms of agility to quickly establish relationships and start collaborating with startups. That's one weakness they have. The second limitation is that when they team up with startups, don't change the culture, right? They just remain who they are, and they just are looking for a particular technology, right, that the startup can bring to the table. But that doesn't fundamentally change the business model, or as you said, the mental model of the large company. So I think, yes, I think Accor and several companies like Air Liquide, and even BNP Paribas that I talk about in my book, what they are doing is they are actually reaching out to these frugal innovators in the startup world, not only to get access to new technologies or new products, but actually get access to new perspectives and new mindsets as well. I think that is how open innovation can really, bring its maximum benefit if companies team up to shift and broaden the mindset instead of reinforcing what they already know.
And there's this line in the book which said, companies practice open innovation today mainly to become more efficient, doing better what they already do, rather than become more adaptable and agile. And I have found that in my experience to be very true. I mean, you can snap up a whole bunch of companies in the market because you think, that's the next big thing, or, partner with them because it's the, cool thing to do. But if at the heart of it, you're not changing your approach and your DNA stays what it is, you're not likely to reap any from it. And so, this is a good segue into that part of the conversation, which is, well, what is the mental model of a leader wanting to be involved in open innovation, or who believes that the time for frugal innovation has come? What would you say are the top 3 competencies or skills or abilities that such a leader should have if they really want to, leverage the potential of this open innovation?
Sure. The first most important practice is that you have to create a sense of urgency. And I think they always say necessity is the mother of invention. So people don't innovate unless, put it bluntly, fire under the ass, right? So you have to create that fire. And there are a couple of ways to do that. I call them positive constraints. So you need to create a set of constraints that are not so stifling that people end up, panicking and switch to survival mode. So it has to be at the right level. So that's one way you can do, is essentially create a very aggressive, target and a big hairy goal. That's if you want to change the whole company. But you can also, create constraints by setting a target for developing a product that has never been done in the company, right? So the example I give with the car maker Renault, the French car maker Renault, because they actually, 2005, they launched a car at the price of 6,000 euros, which required their, leaders in the company, engineers and business people, to completely shift their perspective on how to make a car, how to build a car, how to design a car. And they pulled it off. It took a lot of efforts, but they made it. Again, they, set the bar not high, but kind of low in a way, by saying, go ahead and you guys figure out how you'll develop a car at $5,000. And they pulled it off. So these are the two things companies, executive leaders can do, which is, to set some kind of aggressive, targets in terms of time and say, within 5-10 years, we are going to completely change the company, more frugal. You can also say, well, let's create a product that will have such a very bold and frugal price point that sounds mission impossible. And that will essentially create a sense of, urgency and unleash the, the creativity of people in the company.
And so that's kind of setting the context for what the company would like to do. Because you've talked to so many of these leaders, you've seen them in action. In terms of the mindset, right? How these leaders think, and in terms of how they ought to be thinking, did you notice anything that you felt stood out for them? Because leaders tend to stick to a leadership style that probably made them very successful in the past. But as it's famously said, what got you here won't get you there. The leaders were born in an era of functional excellence and ROI, of looking at far more mechanical parameters than the VUCA world that we operate in. But if they focus too much of that, they're probably missing out on the opportunity. And you have also done some work with leaders in your book, From Smart to Wise, which is acting and leading with wisdom. So I was hoping you could bring together what you were noticing in From Smart to Wise, what you observed here in Frugal Innovation, to see what was standing out for you for these what these leaders were doing.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, one important data point that will really interest you. The average age of the 50 companies profiled in my book is 68 years old. And the combined life experience of these companies, I think it's about 7,000 years old. So my point is that, I deliberately, with my co-author, picked companies, whether it's a GE or Renault and Unilever, which have been around the block for a long time. And I start with that data point because that means that a leader who joins a company only a few years ago needs to have the courage to say, you know what, we will stick to the core values of the company, but there are many other things we may have to change. For example, we may had a business model that was very profitable for decades, but we have to let it go. We need to kind of unlearn a lot of things that benefited us and relearn new tricks, which brings to the kind of quality of leaders is this kind of audacity, this kind of moral courage to do the right thing. And they're not looking for approval, from either the board or from shareholders, because they think long term. They think so long term that actually that what they are seeding today as the kind of the grains of this change may bear fruit long after they're gone, but that's okay for them. Thinking very short term about how can it benefit me as a person, but how can it benefit the company and potentially the society as well. So I think this wisdom that I see in these frugal CEOs, as I call them, is to really think long term, have a larger sense of purpose, and really be, kind of courageous. Now, having said that, I want to kind of very quickly talk about the other quality, which is important. They delegate like hell. They don't try to micromanage. Either appoint some executives who then implement the vision, or they create an environment that is conducive for more kind of, bottom-up grassroots innovation to flourish. But either way, these are not megalomaniac, powerful CEOs. They have great communication skills that allow them to communicate, inspire, and win over more stakeholders, to join their journey.
So it's the mindset of being open leaders who are not afraid to share their power. It's not power over people, but rather power with people. I'm really curious to ask you this question because of focus on innovation. I have always maintained that diversity is an innovation metrics. We tend to kind of get lost in the conversation on the numbers and the percentages of people at the board level or the minority representation, which is just one way to think about it. But ultimately, diversity drives innovation, and that's why it deserves our attention. And you have to lead and collaborate with people who think, feel, and act very differently from you. In your book, you have talked about collaborating with competitors, something that normally is not even a part of our mental model. What is your advice on how to do that more effectively? Why is it that at one end I hear companies talking about innovation is so central and important to us, and at the other hand, the diversity agenda just doesn't get the attention it deserves?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And I think in my book, I give several examples of companies that actually team up with a diverse set of partners. For example, GE, coming back to them, GE Healthcare now is partnering a lot with NGOs or government agencies. These are kind of stakeholders they never dealt with before, right? So they used to deal with hospitals or, or private sector kind of entities. There's a diverse set of partners they have to now learn to team up with and collaborate with. And it's not easy, but I think what again happens, like going back to the discussion we had about leadership, is that if you can create a shared sense of purpose, a larger kind of noble cause, then you can transcend, if you like, the kind of the individual interest of these different members will come together. Because one of the reasons diversity doesn't work is because, as you said, there's a divergent interest, right? Which is good, but can also be bad, because then it's very difficult to get everybody to agree on anything. So this is where I think leadership is important. If you can create this larger sense of purpose for this eclectic mix of partners, then they're able to transcend, their kind of self-interest or their divergent kind of backgrounds to really contribute to a shared kind of goal. So that's what I have seen again is that, there's this Hindi expression says 1 + 1 = 11. Diversity only works if, on the one hand, you respect and even, enhance the individuality of different members in a team, but you have to do that in a very kind of coherent and cohesive way so that 1 + 1 ends up being, 11 and not 2 or 3.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point.
Yeah, can I give one example? I mean, this brings up another. See, diversity is not just about, sex or, skin color, right? Diversity for me is all about diverse points of view, right? And this is actually, I can share this personal perspective, but I'm just reading this book, Ram by Devdutt Patnaik, who is an author from India I respect a lot. And it really says that, the shift from smart leadership to wise leadership happens is when a person is able to accommodate multiple points of view in his mind and integrate them, right? So that is the supreme form of intelligence, right? Which is the ability to have two conflicting viewpoints in your mind and still try to synergize them. And I think that's why I feel like, in the VUCA that you talked about earlier, no single point of view that can win the day, right? So you need to kind of really say, I have my point of view, but I'm not. So you need to have a sense of vulnerability and humility to say, but maybe I'm wrong, right? So maybe it's a wise thing for me to reach out to people who may think differently. Maybe by having this different perspective, maybe come to a solution that will be more resilient, right, and more robust to survive in a VUCA world than if I try to simply impose my point of view on everyone else.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about Devdutt's work and that concept. There's another book, if you haven't read it, which is in kind of the same genre. It's called The Opposable Mind.
Yes.
And it is exactly that, to take two conflicting ideas. I think I would say that a very important for leaders in the new world is to recognize that they don't have all the answers. And when they don't have all the answers, then they have to be able to get the best from the people around them, and that doesn't mean that they will necessarily agree, but that ability to step back and give each idea equal consideration is, I think, a very, very important competency. As we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, given all the work you've been doing through the years with organizations, process of writing the book as well as your speaking, one thing you could change about the way leaders are leading today, what would that one thing be and why? I know I put you on a little bit of a spot there because there are probably so many things you would wish companies and leaders would do differently. But is there like there's one thing that you keep saying, why do they do it this way? They really need to be doing it differently, but they don't seem to get it. What would
Sure.
that one thing be?
Yeah, I mean, I already knew what I'm going to say, but I was trying to say it in a very formal way. And I think what I'd like to see is leaders being driven by hope and optimism. And so that means it's okay to be more playful. And I think I always say that the term ingenuity almost rhymes with the idea of being ingenious, which is also about being innocent. I think move up in the corporate ladder, we are expected to know everything, and people are frightened that they will find themselves as leaders in a situation where they don't have answers to a particular situation. And I think when I look at kids, I sometimes feel like they can teach us so much about leadership because they have the single most important quality to ask why not. So I think that's one thing I would like to see leaders, basically manifest, is a sense of curiosity and wonderment, which I feel is lost as you move up the ladder because you become more jaded, you become more experienced. So I think innocence is the new source of competitive advantage, and experience becomes the new burden that you have to unload if you really want to, succeed in the VUCA world.
Thank you so much, Navi, for your time. I really learned a lot reading your book, and I very highly recommend it to anyone who is trying to understand the variety of ways in which leaders and companies are shifting the way they have led their people and themselves. Navi.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning into the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and you were able to take away some ideas to start using in your own career as well as your leadership journey. That concludes this episode of Leaders Upgraded. But wait, your journey is just getting started. Go to www.leadersupgraded.com for more insights, more inspiration, and more tools to continue the journey. And if you have someone who you would like to nominate for the podcast or a particular topic you'd like us to cover, then also visit www.leadersupgraded.com and let us know. If you like this episode, please do share it. Please do subscribe to the podcast. And I look forward to continued upgrade with you. Take care.